was very interested, actually, in what you were saying about neural networks and machine learning and their limits, because I'm a BBC reporter, I do technology news, and often by the time these things reach my desk, they've gone horribly wrong. And yet we're supposed to believe that they're going to, fight misinformation, give us reasonable quotes on our car insurance, all of this stuff. How good are they right now? Are they being oversold?
Well, I still believe that we have to be able to identify places where the neural networks have the potential to get it wrong. And so there's a lot of attention being paid at Google, and I'm sure elsewhere at DeepMind, to explaining how a neural network got to its conclusion. Because right now, in all honesty, if someone says, well, how did it get to this conclusion? You kind of point at this thing and say, well, there's 100 million neurons in there, and they have the following little mathematical values, and something came out the bottom. And that does not satisfy most people as a way of explaining what was going on. Even though it works really well for many cases, we really need the ability to go back and figure out what it was, how did it reach that conclusion. Now, there's some interesting ideas along these lines. Let me bring you back to that 100 by 100 array and the 10,000 pixels. Imagine that you've got this neural network put together, and what you're trying to figure out is which neurons in the neural network respond most strongly to particular pixels in the image. It might give you kind of an idea of where the sensitivities are in the system. So you can imagine some very regular process of twiddling the pixels, that's a technical term, twiddling the pixels and seeing which of the neurons respond to changes in the system that might begin to categorize where the system is very sensitive to its inputs. I'm not suggesting that that's the solution to the problem. It's the kind of thing that you would want to do to begin to understand the way in which the neural network is sensitive to inputs in the system and, of course, what outputs come out. We have a long ways to go, before, in my opinion, before we have a satisfactory way of explaining how these neural networks are working, how they might be sensitive. And in fact, it's important for us to figure that out so we can anticipate ahead of time and not let the neural network use inputs that it will misunderstand, or at least be prepared to detect that we're off in some not so fruitful path.
Are you optimistic about the decentralization of the internet?
Yes, I am still very optimistic about all this. Now this gets into a really tricky position, right? This is sort of are you optimistic because you don't want to be wrong about the thing you invented? I still believe that there is great good coming out of the network, the huge amounts of information that's available. But I am very sensitive to the fact that there are ways of taking this platform and doing abusive things with it. And so finding a way to suppress the abusive behaviors, or at least to reduce their effectiveness while maintaining all of the value that we can see is possible out of the net, is a big challenge. But I think that I have not despaired yet of this. I think there are people of goodwill, companies of goodwill, and technologies that will help us. But this is not a trivial exercise. It's actually a serious piece of work that we have to engage in.
Do you have an opinion about male bias in programming?
Yes, I do. I hate it. It makes me very angry, and I'll give you a couple of anecdotes about that. I happened to go to West Point to lecture, and the woman who was running the computer science department at West Point and I talked exactly about this. And she said to me that her practice was not to allow fewer than 3 women into any class that she taught. If it was male-dominated, she did not want to teach a class with fewer than 3 women, because if there was only 1 woman, all she could do was sound defensive when these jerks were giving her a hard time. But if there were at least 2 other women there to defend her, it worked better. And so there's a clear recognition in that case that this is an issue. I've seen it happen at other universities, I won't name which ones, but I've had women come to me saying they dropped out of the computer science program because the guys were full of hormones and they were jerks and they behaved badly. It makes me so angry when I hear that, particularly given that when I started work at IBM in 1965, I know that sounds like it was just after the American Civil War, but there were about 50% women in the systems engineering class. And some of them were from English majors and history majors. And I remember scratching my head thinking, why didn't they just hire math majors? And there was a reason. They didn't want to have people who had already learned bad programming practices. The IBM wanted to teach them how to program the IBM way. So they had these people coming from a variety of different disciplines. But that 50% number diminished rapidly. And I think Wendy can certainly talk to this at Southampton. Is it getting any better, Wendy? No, it's not. So I don't have a good answer for you. Maybe it's all women, in a class, so they get rid of these jerks. But I'll tell you how a related thing. The deputy director of the computer science department at West Point was also the guy who ran the rowing teams. And when he got there, he noticed that their practices were segregated into men and women. And he noticed that the men would say things like, "You row like a woman." And he said, well, he's going to put a stop to that. He made them practice in mixed teams. And the women turned out to be better than the guys were in many cases. And that put an end to that kind of crap. So I think there are tactics around that we should be applying. But the thing I hope more than anything is that we will encourage young women, especially early on, to stick with it and to protect their interest and encourage it, because they are, I don't want to lose the bright minds that are out there to something else just because a bunch of guys were being stupid.
Do you believe that computer technology has gone into too many variants?
You mean it's just infecting everything in its path?
Everything becoming computerized, are we over-reliant?
Well, yes and no. The yes side of me says I'm very nervous about the brittleness of the infrastructure that we are building right now, that we are depending on. This is not just about computers. This is, in general, we are creating a society which is extremely dependent on a very, very complex infrastructure. I have another anecdote for you about that. I was in San Diego. I was lecturing at a Marconi Society meeting. And in the middle of the lecture, I sort of casually mentioned that although we were talking about communications technology, as one would expect, I said that I thought that we were even more dependent on electricity than we were on radio communication. And about 3 hours later, all the power went out in San Diego for 2 days. Because somebody was doing some maintenance procedure in Arizona and they missed one step and it created a cascade failure that went all the way down to the border in Mexico and up to Los Angeles. And then after 2 days went by and everything got back into order, I got an email from someone who had been at the lecture saying, you didn't have to do that to make the point. So I'm overly sensitive to the fact that our societies have become intensely interdependent. There's a report that went to the Secretary General of the United Nations from a high-level panel on digital cooperation, which is trying to talk about how international cooperation would be needed in order to create a safer environment online. But the thing that we said in that report, we called it an age of interdependence. And just now, as we look at the consequences of the coronavirus and the side effects, you can see the places where we have become interdependent and where the supply chains are not as reliable as we would like. It does make me nervous that we don't have as much resilience built into our infrastructure. This is also true of the computing infrastructure. And so it feels to me like we have work to do to build a much more resilient computing infrastructure and communications infrastructure in order to avoid the consequences of various kinds of failure. And I put my money where my mouth is. I live in Northern Virginia, where you would think 12 miles from the White House, which is That's a different problem. You would think that we would have reliable electrical power. But a year went by when we had 2 5-day power failures. And now I have 3,000 bottle wine cellar. And so after those 2 experiences, I became quite nervous about the wine, especially during the summer months. So we installed a 50 kilowatt generator in the backyard. And although it runs on natural gas, and that's a bad thing because it produces carbon dioxide, I'm willing to accept that as a price to pay for keeping my bottles from going bad. And it's also acknowledgement of the fact that the power system is not as reliable as one would like, even there. And if you look more generally at the deep power requirements we have around the world, you can see how vital it is to find alternative sources of power, including renewables, in order to be less dependent on things like gas and oil and coal.
Oh, yes, the interplanetary internet. How's that going?
So I'm very excited about this. You may remember that the 2 Mars landings, first successful Mars landings were in 1976, the 2 Viking landers. And then 20 years went by and nothing worked, and many failed landings and other experiments. And then in 1997, the Pathfinder robot landed successfully on Mars. And this was very exciting for everybody. And you remember how they delivered it? They delivered it in a giant balloon that bounced its way along. And I'm sure if somebody had come into me at the Jet Propulsion Lab and said, here's how we're going to deliver your $6 billion device, I would have thrown them out of my office. But it worked. So anyway, we were all very excited. I have a post at JPL as a visiting scientist. So in the following year, or in the spring of 1998, the team at JPL and I got together and we said, what would happen if we had an interplanetary internet? Instead of just relying on point-to-point radio links, which we have been relying on for the whole history of space exploration. So we started thinking our way through this, and we thought, well, why don't we just use the internet protocols? I mean, they seem to work okay on Earth, so what's wrong with that? And it would probably work okay on Mars, but we started doing the math about the distances between the planets, and we discovered that the speed of light was too slow. Because it takes 20 minutes for a signal to go from Earth to Mars when we're farthest apart in our orbits. That's 235 million miles, which is nothing in terms of the kind of distances we see even within our own solar system, let alone the rest of the galaxy. So, and there's this other problem. We notice that the planets are rotating, and we don't know how to stop that. And so if you're talking to something on the surface and the planet rotates, eventually you have to wait till it comes back around again to talk to it again. So we ended up designing a set of protocols that we call delay and disruption tolerant networking protocols. When the 2 rovers landed in 2004, Spirit and Opportunity, the original plan was that they would transmit data back to Earth directly from the surface of Mars at the blazing speed of 28.5 kilobits a second, which made the scientists moderately grumpy. And they were going back from the surface to a big 70-meter dish system. We have 3 70-meter dishes at Canberra, Australia, Goldstone, California, and Madrid, Spain. And as the Earth turns, those big antennas are looking out at the solar system. But when we turned the radios on the Spirit and Opportunity, they overheated. And so immediately we backed off and said, okay, we have to reduce the duty cycle so we don't harm the radio equipment. And of course, now that made the scientists even more grumpy, until somebody noticed that there was an X-band radio on the rovers and an X-band radio on board the orbiters that we'd sent a few years before to map the surface of Mars to decide where the rover should go. So they said, well, what if we reprogram the rovers and the orbiters to use the prototype interplanetary software? So we did that. We actually uploaded software. I have to tell you, when you do something like this and you're putting software on board a thing that's 200 million miles away, and then it all works. It's sort of like a miracle. It's a miracle when software works. So we use the prototype software to carry all the data back from Spirit and Opportunity and subsequent Mars landers. In the meantime, we've been standardizing the protocols and refining them. They're now standardized by the Consultative Committee on Space Data Systems. They are now adopted and will be used by ESA, NASA, JAXA, the Korean Space Agency, and anyone else who wants to. They're publicly available. They're freely available. Source code is available. The plan now on the US side is to use these protocols in the Gateway program, which is our return to the moon, and which we hope will allow us to exercise the architecture in order to support the missions to Mars to come. So honest to God, we are very, very excited about the current state of affairs. We're operating on the prototype system between Earth, Mars, and the International Space Station, and we hope to be on Gateway in 2024. So all of this, for me anyway, is really exciting. I mean, I'm not going to be around for when this thing finally blossoms. Each time we send a mission out to do a scientific measurement or something, eventually when those robots become spacecraft, finish their primary scientific missions, they can be repurposed as nodes of an interplanetary backbone, so we can grow this step by step. I won't see the end of it, but being around for the beginning of it, it's been really exciting. So thank you for asking about that.
So that's a question about regulation. Where do we go with regulation and who should fund it?
So ironically, this question came up today because I was meeting at the House of Lords with the committee that's worried about digital technology and democracy, and related questions came up. So two things. First of all, the redundancy needs to be built into the system. And you and I will pay for that, but we will want to pay for that because we want the reliability. We cannot afford to have a fragile system that we are relying on that isn't reliable. So in that sense, it has to be built into the system, and that means that the cost has to be affordable. Otherwise, why would we pay for it at all? So I think we have the challenges to the designers of these systems to try to keep costs under control enough that we have a reliable system. With regard to regulation, it's a tricky business to get it right, because if you over-regulate or you over-specify, it won't be applicable as technology sweeps out from under you. But principles are actually a helpful thing, and often legislation speaks to the principle behind what it is you're trying to accomplish. And the regulation doesn't necessarily have to dive too deep into specific implementations as much as the intent, the behavior that you want to incent or incite. So my sense right now is that the most important thing we can do about these regulations is to figure out how do we pose them in such a way that it will produce a positive incentive for companies to do what is needed. For example, commitments to long-term support for the software and its updating, not even necessarily to increase its functionality, but just to fix bugs at the least, to provide for the cases where you can no longer do that for whatever reason, then you have to make sure the source code is available, an escrow arrangement. There's a related regulatory issue that having to do with the fragility of digital content over long periods of time. If you think about all the spreadsheets that you make and the digital pictures that you take, 100 years from now, will they still be renderable? Will you still be able to interact with them? You might say, does anybody want to? But in fact, historians often need access to documents that have existed for a long time. But if they were encoded in some form and the software wasn't there to decode and properly present or allow you to interact with the spreadsheet or allow you to interact with a game, then what do we do about that? And so part of the answer is that we need to provide incentives for that software to be retained in archives and available for people to use in order to get access to and make use of the documents that we're trying to preserve. And if you look at what your National Archives has done in terms of holding documentary material for hundreds of years and try to translate that into digital documents, you see that we're very far away from having a regime that will provide incentive to do that. One issue, for example, is intellectual property. What happens if 50 years from now somebody needs to run an old version of Microsoft or something? The question is, are they allowed to do that or not? And how long does patent control last? Should there be a carve-out for an archive to have the right to run software that it didn't necessarily buy, but it is using it for purposes of archival preservation? We need to think our way through that. Otherwise, we may face a kind of a fragile, dark future.
So an environmental question. Can we ever mitigate the environmental impact of the internet and the way it works?
So there has been a lot of speculation about the idea that data centers are consuming increasing amounts of power, for example, and that somehow that's an unstoppable curve. I can give you some very good news that Google's data centers, for example, have not been consuming more power per data center. It's true that we build more data centers, but we're not building an infinite number of those. What's been amazing is that the hardware and the cooling systems and everything else have been able to operate with increased capacity but no more power requirements. So that's a feasibility example. I am fairly convinced at this point that we will not be polluting the atmosphere necessarily because of the data centers. In fact, if anything, Google at least has managed to get to the point where we are 100% green. However, some of that green is purchased, carbon credits, but a lot of it is using renewable power sources. We've invested in 30-year contracts for renewable power in a variety of places, whether it's solar or wind, for example. So the idea here is that we should all be investing to make sure that we are not overtaxing the existing systems and making as much use of renewable as possible. And so I'm pretty happy with the way Google has operated. I can't speak for any of the others because I don't know enough in detail about what they've done. But I think at least it's been demonstrated that it's feasible to achieve an objective which does not overburden the environment. Now, the other side of this coin is whether we can use the computing capacity and the data gathering and analysis capacity and the AI capacity that the internet and its data centers bring in order to deal with the global warming problem. And that's the different side of the picture, and I'm frankly hoping that the computing power of Google and others will be applicable to helping to solve the problem, finding optimal ways for us to either generate or distribute power or use other resources, or even figure out what the side effects of global warming are going to be. For example, it would be really valuable to know that at certain levels of temperature rise, where will the borders of the continents be? Because they will shrink because of sea rise. Some of it will be because of ice melting, and some of it will be because warm water is actually, expands as it warms up. And that means that the sea will be rising higher. It's because of the temperature, not just because of ice melt. So we can use the computer power of the internet to help us anticipate what will happen. And then, of course, the next question is whether we have the courage to then do the right thing in order to respond in time for what those changes imply.
Thank you so much. We're out of time for questions, I'm afraid. Please join me in thanking Vint Cerf for a very insightful and interesting talk.
Thank you very much.